pieces there.
Sure. Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire. That has been relayed to all parties involved in the ceasefire. As you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu put out a statement last night in support of the ceasefire, in support of the United States' efforts, and he's also assured the president they'll continue to be a helpful partner throughout the course of the next 2 weeks.
So is the ceasefire already breaking down? Is Trump getting freaking humiliated? And what's currently happening between Israel, Lebanon, and the Strait of Hormuz? We'll address that today, but I first want to start by just encouraging people to stop freaking out about literally everything. You know, this is a common tactic deployed by anti-Trumpers and panicans, which is that whenever Trump makes any diplomatic breakthrough, whether that's a trade deal, a ceasefire, or a peace deal, and there's any minor violations or misunderstandings that take place immediately after the fact, they will use that as proof to say, see, there is no ceasefire, there's no peace deal, Trump sucks at diplomacy, he's humiliated, and this is proof we're going to have heckin' World War III. And notice how that just never happens. I would point out this is the same exact thing they did last year during the 12-day war. If you may remember, they tried to say that Trump's peace deal was fake because, look, Israel is still sending the jets as we speak. And then Trump called Israel, told them to turn around. They complied. And notice how the peace deal held, at least up until Operation Epic Fury. Same thing, by the way, with the Gaza peace deal, where these characters tried to argue that, look, because there was still some minor fighting that took place after the peace agreement, or allegedly Hamas and some other Palestinian militias were going at it with one another, that was obviously the clear evidence that this thing is not over. Israel's about to go and bomb and invade Gaza once again. And notice how nobody talks about Gaza anymore, because that's not what happened. It turns out that getting hysterical about every little thing, first of all, is not good for your cortisol levels and your stress, but secondly, doesn't really actually make you correct about the world. Notice how people who kind of just sit back and trust the plan and trust in Trump actually end up often on the right side of these things and not the wrong side. And that said, understanding that, just a pretext for what we're about to cover today, let us discuss the current misunderstanding, it would seem, as it pertains to Israel fighting Hezbollah and whether that falls under the ceasefire agreement. Because what effectively just went down today is that Iran tried to, or at least claimed that they once again closed the Strait of Hormuz because they claimed Israel was breaking the ceasefire by fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon. Ever since, both Israel and the U.S. have come out to clarify that actually Lebanon was never part of the ceasefire agreement. Iran, what are you talking about? And there's this whole mess going on. Now, again, I repeat, this seems like a very normal type of diplomatic mix-up that will be resolved, again, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours, but people seem to think this is obvious proof that it's never going to end, or Trump is controlled by Israel, or just a bunch of, again, hysterical nonsense that I don't think is actually true. But nonetheless, we will address that in today's video and explain for you what is currently happening with this situation. So that said, guys, do us a favor. If you enjoy our content, make sure you hit that like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you are new. That's the best way to support our work. It also ensures that you can stay up to date with all of the latest news and coverage. And that said, this whole story begins today as, again, Israel starts launching more attacks against Hezbollah over in Lebanon, claiming, of course, that that has nothing to do with the ceasefire agreement, which is between the coalition and Iran itself. So take a listen.
By the Iranians, having to do with the fundamental commitment to guaranteeing a non-aggression pact with the regime, and additionally Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz, accepting that Iran can enrich uranium. It appears that point is now void following the president's post on Truth Social and the removal of primary and secondary sanctions on Iran. Down a little bit further on the list is a broader ceasefire, including Israel's conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon. But we can report right now that the Israelis have just launched a series of airstrikes across Beirut. The IDF is describing this as the largest attack against Hezbollah since this operation began. Overnight, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreeing with President Trump in a post on X, saying Israel also supports the U.S. effort to ensure that Iran no longer poses a nuclear missile and terror threat to America, Israel, Iran's Arab neighbors, and the world. The 2-week ceasefire does not include Lebanon. That, according to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right. So according to Israel, the ceasefire does not include Hezbollah or Lebanon. Iran is trying to argue that it is. Who's right here and who's wrong? Well, although I'm well familiar that if you say anything remotely defensive of Israel on the internet, you will be called all sorts of names and be accused of being a paid shill and all those things. But I would point out that Israel in this case does seem to be principally correct because of the fact that while the Iranian 10-point proposal that they just mentioned did include a ceasefire with Hezbollah over in Lebanon, we repeat, the U.S. didn't agree to the 10 points. We made that very clear. We said we're going to stop hostilities and use the 10 points as a framework for future negotiations. But by my understanding, that was never something that the coalition actually agreed to say, oh, Iran's correct about the 10 points. And notice how, right? In the past 24 hours, by the way, partially thanks to hostile media networks like CNN, there has been this mass international confusion where a bunch of people think that, again, the coalition agreed to Israel's 10 points and not agreed to just use them as a framework. So what I'm trying to say there is that nobody actually ever agreed to a ceasefire with Lebanon. They just said, Iran just now basically claiming that's the case. But that said, so apparently in response, the Iranian state media had reported today that it had halted the passage of oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz after these Israeli attacks, basically arguing that, you screwed up here, you're violating it, and you need to stop attacking Lebanon. Take a listen.
Good morning. We start with breaking news. State media reports that Iran has halted the passage of oil tankers through the Strait of Hormuz after Israeli attacks on Hezbollah in Lebanon. Earlier today, we know 2 vessels were able to go through this passageway. But again, state media is reporting that the Iranians are choking off the strait. I just got off the phone with a senior Israeli official who was sounding the alarm about this action by the Iranians, saying only just a few hours into this ceasefire, the Iranians are already showing that they are trying to leverage their control over the strait and put pressure on global energy trade.
Yeah, so what does the U.S. government think of this? Well, let's first start by simply addressing Iran's move to allegedly close the Strait of Hormuz, because there are still open questions as to whether they actually did that. As you know by now, as we've established, Iranian state media likes to run its mouth a lot, and it's often not actually backed up by their real or behind-the-scenes actions. And that is something today that Caroline Leavitt even noted, arguing that the president is made aware of those reports and does not believe that they actually are accurate in that case. Take a listen.
Media is saying that Iran has now closed off the Strait of Hormuz today in response to Israeli attacks on Lebanon. What's the White House response to that? And you just listed many military successes. I understand that. But strategically, how is the administration arguing that Iran does not have more economic leverage than it did before the start of the war?
Sure. Well, with respect to the first reporting out of Iranian state media, the president was made aware of those reports before I came to the podium. That is completely unacceptable. And again, this is a case of what they're saying publicly is different privately. We have seen an uptick of traffic in the Strait today, and I will reiterate the president's expectation and demand that the Strait of Hormuz is reopened immediately, quickly, and safely. That is his expectation. It has been relayed to him privately that is what's taking place, and these reports publicly are false.
Yeah, so it is worth noting that traffic did halt today in the Strait of Hormuz following this announcement by Iran, but it's still unclear at the moment whether that's directly because of Iranian action or simply because the misinformation is creating fear, right? The oil tankers are just too scared to cross the strait, which is something we've seen happen already multiple different times. So again, we don't really know, but I remain firm in my stance. I believe this situation is going to sort itself out. In the end, it's not going to be seen as a big deal. And that is something that J.D. Vance further corroborated today. So he first of all goes on to state he believes it's a legitimate misunderstanding where Iran thought the ceasefire included Lebanon, but the U.S. is actually backing Israel's position to say, objectively, it doesn't. That was never part of the agreement that Lebanon was ever covered by that very fact. So take a listen to what he had to say as well.
First of all, I actually think, and there's a lot of bad faith negotiation and a lot of bad faith propaganda going on. I think this comes from a legitimate misunderstanding. I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states.
Yeah, so again, I remain committed to the idea that this is going to work itself out. It's not that big a deal, and in the end, it may even resolve itself in the next 24 hours. Now, you could make an argument, and perhaps President Trump will say this to Israel, that, hey, even though it wasn't in the ceasefire, how about for the sake of good faith, just to ensure the negotiations go smoothly and we don't have more diplomatic problems, maybe cool off a little bit with Lebanon for the time being, and we'll talk about that later. But again, still, the U.S. is backing Israel here by just saying factually, yeah, that was never a part of the formal ceasefire agreement that was made here with Iran. That said, I do think that Iran's pivot here does indicate a very interesting question, which is that how is Iran in their place to negotiate a ceasefire in Lebanon on behalf of Hezbollah? And this actually poses a really interesting argument, which is that, well, if we're to say, right, if you make a ceasefire with Iran, if Iran is to say, I should say, that if you make a ceasefire with Iran, you also have to make a ceasefire with Hezbollah, then that basically argues that Hezbollah is a direct extension of Iran itself. Now, we well know and we're all familiar with the fact that Hezbollah obviously is an Iranian proxy group, right? But again, if we're to say this is a ceasefire with Iran's military and Iran's armed forces, and Iran is basically making the case that Hezbollah, a terrorist militia group in another country halfway across the Gulf, is also part of their military, then I would actually say that undermines a lot of Iranian arguments about themselves being the ones here who were attacked and are acting in self-defense, right? Because it'd be one thing to claim, oh, sure, Hezbollah's backed by Iran, they're funded by Iran, but they're not part of Iran, right? They're not really acting on our behalf. They're their own independent group. Okay, right? Iran's been saying that. We understand a lot of countries around the world fight proxy wars, whatever. But you notice now, Iran's not doing that. Iran's treating Hezbollah as one of their own. If that's the case, and by the way, you would assume the same is likely true of Hamas, because that's another Iranian proxy group, then how can Iran sit there and claim that they just got attacked for no reason, right? They're basically making an admission right now, which you could say maybe is true, that their armed forces have effectively invaded half of the Middle East, Iran directly, not some proxy group loosely backed by Iran, but Iran proper, right, is starting wars. Iran did October 7th. Iran is fighting. Iran, by the way, has killed countless U.S. soldiers in the Iraq conflict, right, following Saddam Hussein, when basically Iranian-backed terrorist groups started taking over the country. And we know that's true, by the way, right? Iran is responsible for most of the problems in the war on terror. However, right, if you're going to say, well, no, that's their proxy group, so it doesn't directly justify hitting the country itself. Notice how Iran right now is basically saying Hezbollah is not a proxy group. They're part of our armed forces. Why am I bringing that whole point up? Not just to expose a potential moral inconsistency here from Iran, but furthermore because I've said this, the entire time, that in order for a meaningful long-term peace to be made here with Iran, I'm not demanding that the Islamic Republic totally go away. I know some people think that's the only path to peace. I would say I'd be open to the idea of the Islamic Republic reforming. However, a big component of that, if they want to normalize relations, if they want to become a normal country, if they want the lifting of sanctions, etc., is that they have to drop this ideological revolution. They have to stop basically funding wars and funding proxies across the Middle East, trying to overthrow half of their neighboring governments, right? So that would mean, hey, Iran, right? If you want to focus on your own country and you want to truly pretend as if you haven't started a bunch of problems, stop funding Hezbollah, stop funding Hamas, stop funding the Houthi rebels, right? Stop destabilizing all of your neighbors. And notice how right now, in this case, they're sort of admitting publicly, I guess you could say, that they were and are sort of doing that, right? Funding these proxies across the world. Now, again, I'm sure that there's a certain cast of characters, even on the right wing, because it's trendy nowadays to say, no, Vince, you're spreading Israeli propaganda, right? Israel's just fighting these wars for no reason or whatever. But notice how, right? And the people have asked, how many countries has Iran invaded? Iran hasn't started any wars. They haven't started any problems. They're basically admitting right now that Hamas, the Houthi rebels, Hezbollah, all of these entities are direct extensions of their armed forces, which is to say they actually have started a bunch of wars and they have invaded a bunch of their neighbors. And it should be right now a big point in the peace talks. If you want normalized relations, if you want Israel to stop, by the way, then you also have to stop, right? This whole narrative that, again, I understand that with certain people, like Israel is always the eternal bad guy, but you have to also point out an objective truth, which is that Iran is no saint in this story either, right? They objectively have been causing a bunch of issues, of course, in a time period right now in the Middle East when a bunch of other Arab countries have, for pragmatic and smart, wise reasons, made peace deals with Israel, right? Egypt normalized relations with Israel. The Gulf states under the Abraham Accords doing the same exact thing. And just understanding, okay, it's better to coexist peacefully and basically make money and economically prosper than the fight. Iran is the sole actor in the Middle East who still keeps causing all the problems, right? And again, it's hard to argue you're just acting in self-defense against Zionist imperialism or antagonism or whatever, when you are directly admitting, yes, we invaded a bunch of countries bordering Israel, even Israel itself, you could argue, if Palestine's supposed to be Israeli territory, right? And keep on bombing them and invading them and causing problems, and like we did October 7th. I'm just going to point that out about the whole thing, okay? So that's true on one hand. I find it interesting on the other hand that, it is a known fact that Israel is not super thrilled about the fact that we did do a ceasefire deal with Iran, which, and by the way, they're also signaling, well, if America demands we stop in Lebanon, then we'd be open to it. Because going back to addressing, this certain cast of characters, I was told that Trump was controlled by Israel, right? Remember, I mean, you probably know who I'm talking about, but how many times have you heard that from so many characters? Trump is a Zio shill. He's bought by Israel. All of American foreign policy is being done by Israel. We have no independent agency. We don't even have a real president. And notice how, against the will of Israel, we're doing this ceasefire deal right now. Just a point I'd like to make about the relationship there.
Well, the Israelis, for what they know so far with the details in this 2-week delay in the war, they're not too happy with the details, but they say it's President Trump's decision to make.
Yeah, so in their own words, Israel is not happy with the ceasefire, but they acknowledge that it's Trump's decision to make. Really funny how that works, right? Because I've been told reliably for several months now that this is all about Israel. This is a war for Israel. Trump is controlled by Israel. America doesn't have any sovereignty. We don't make any independent decisions. Oh, really funny how we just made a huge independent diplomatic decision that actually went against what Israel wanted. Israel lobbied against it, but notice how President Trump is his own independent man with his own agency, right? And of course, but again, I've been told reliably by the third worlders, by a lot of these alleged right-wingers that, this is entirely 100% a war for Israel, right? Regardless of whether you agree with it or not, that America doesn't have any strategic reason to also oppose Iran, right? Nothing's happened in the past 40 to 50 years that would also create separate, independent, arguable reasons why America would also have issues with Iran. This whole thing is just about Israel, and every foreign policy decision in the world is controlled by Israel. A lot of these same people tried to say we took out Nicolas Maduro on behalf of Israel, which literally makes no sense. But I guess when you kind of just devolve into like a basement dwelling conspiracy theory controlling your entire political ideology, hey, this pen right here, right now, it's in my hand because of Israel, just a bunch of this nonsense. But again, I repeat, notice how that's not true. And look, I'll be the first to admit that America and Israel's interests don't always intersect in terms of these Middle Eastern interventions, no matter how much some people like to claim that. Because yes, it is true that if Israel and especially Netanyahu had his way, we wouldn't have done the ceasefire. As a matter of fact, we'd be doing a 2003 style invasion right now, right? We'd be dedicating 10 years and thousands of American lives to go and topple the Ayatollah entirely and make sure that we get a super pro-Israel government or whatever in, Tehran. Yeah, that's all true. But notice how that's not happening. Notice how the U.S. made a different decision. And because the U.S. is the country in charge here, Israel, by and large, has to go along with that decision. Just so something I'd like to point out about, a lot of these people who have been, making a lot of accusations as of late. But, again, Trump is so controlled by Israel. He did a ceasefire that Israel doesn't like. He did a ceasefire, by the way, that a lot of the hardcore neocons, as we pointed out yesterday, are not happy with because they want to get into Iraq 2.0. Trump has pointed out, so there's people on the America First side who think no new wars means never use the military. There's the neocons who think that, we should be invading Iran for the next 10 years and go all the way. And then there's Trump, who clearly favors peace through strength to an extent, but he favors what? Like a strong shows of force with the military, get your strategic objectives done and get out, right? It's not our job to nation build. I've basically framed it as being a very pragmatic foreign policy, right? Not super ideological, more pragmatic. So notice how he's kind of pissing off both sides with this, right? So the super pro-Israel neocons are like, how dare he do the ceasefire? The super, libertarian types are saying, oh, this is controlled by Israel. He said no new wars. And then we have the average Trump supporter who's basically just like, yeah, I just trust Trump. I trust Trump's ability to make diplomacy, the decisions he makes, him to handle foreign policy. And, we've obviously done a lot to explain the rationale and kind of the angles that are going on here. But honestly, okay, if we were to be realistic, trusting Trump when it comes to diplomatic relations and foreign policy is not a bad idea. I think people should honestly just do it more, right? If you don't want to delve into the specifics of everything, just okay, right? I'm a patriot. I trust Trump. There you go. There you go. Right? Notice how he makes both of these people mad. And we're sitting here saying he thinks we should do a ceasefire. We should do a ceasefire. You know what I mean? So, funny how that works. Funny how, again, we're the least stressed out, least hysterical people about everything, and then you have the panicans on both sides running around screaming. All right, that said, guys, let me know your thoughts on this in the comment section down below. Be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and until next time, God bless and peace.